It's been about 2.5 years since I've stood in this pulpit to preach, and I'm so thankful to be here tonight to do just that. But before we get started with that, the elders have asked me to kind of give a report of what's going on with the work where I am. And before I even get to that, the invitation song is 444, and I would have forgot to let you know about that unless I told you just now. But the invitation song is 444. I hope you realize that Willette has just as fine a youth group as any congregation of the Lord's church that I've ever attended or been a part of. And you are really blessed with what you find in these pews. Now, they don't look the same as they did last time I was here, especially the fellas. They've all grown about 6 inches. Some of them can reach up and pull that down if it ever gets stuck on you. But the work in Omaha, Nebraska. I don't know if everybody knows, but me and a good friend of mine, Houston McClure, a fellow student from school, work in Omaha, Nebraska with the West Omaha Church of Christ. You might ask how we ended up in Omaha. I didn't think I would ever end up in Omaha. In fact, I didn't know where Nebraska was on the map until I started looking at this congregation, because the map in my mind is the southeast of the United States. Those are the states that I'm familiar with. But in school, it was getting about a year before we had to leave, and so that's when the talk amongst the students starts happening. What congregation are you going to work with? Do you know where you're going to be? And so we started, at least I did, with my wife Katie, started looking for a congregation to work at in between our parents. And you know where my parents live. Her parents live in Arkansas, and so somewhere that wouldn't be too far to travel, you know, if it's just going off location. So we had a few tryouts, and we got to thinking about it, and along with some other things that were happening in school, especially meeting some friends of mine that were at the school from up north and from out west. I don't know if you know or realize how blessed we are to live in this part of the United States as far as congregations of the Lord's church go. You can go here, and if there's not a church right down the road, there's one somewhere in the county, and there's definitely one in the next county. And you can find plenty of churches here, and if there's not a sound one, sure enough that there's a sound one somewhere around if you look for it. Well, that isn't the case the further north and the further west you go. And I realized that after, like I said, I met some friends of mine, and I visited their congregation, and I said, well, you know, where is the next closest sound congregation to you? And they said 3-4 hours maybe. And in my mind, that's kind of unheard of, because we have so many good congregations, at least around us, and my entire Christian life that had been the case. And so I had thought, what if I were to go and was able to work somewhere where the church wasn't quite as strong? This is a good time to do it. We don't have any kids that we have to financially support, and so if we need to, or if we can go somewhere and work, why not do it? And so my friend Houston was having those same sort of thoughts apparently, and we got to talking about it. And I don't know if you think about how much of an ordeal that might be to go somewhere and try to work with a small, unestablished congregation by yourself. And in fact, when you look at the scriptures, Paul always had a laundry list of folks with him, and I think that was for good reason. And so we said, if we're going to do something like that, why don't we go work together? And so we started looking at congregations that might fit that description. You know, if we thought if this be the Lord's will, we'll pray about it and hopefully we'll find something. Well, we called a small congregation in Omaha, and we said, well, this might not be what you're looking for, but we're looking to work in a place like Omaha, and there's 2 of us that want to come, and we could raise some support if you'd be willing to take us on. And so when you look at a place like Omaha. Omaha is quite different than Red Boiling Springs. Omaha is a city with a metro population of almost 1 million people. And in Omaha, less than 0.5% of those people are members of the church. And so you're talking the Church of Christ. What is that? People don't know what the church is in areas like Omaha, Nebraska. So of a city of a 1 million plus people, you have 600 people in that city that are members of the Church of Christ in some form or fashion, whether that be sound congregations or if they just wear the name. Around 600 people in the entire city. And so we decided to go there to work, and there were some bumps along the way, and that's with any type of taking on like that. But right now, if I were to give you an update about what's happened of recently, we have a good sound group of Christians that we're working with, around 20 folks, and right now we're in a stage where it's as if you're planning the congregation. So there's a group of people there, but they're not they weren't centrally located, meeting in house to house when we got there, and sometimes it was at different houses. And right now we're beginning to get a consistency. We're meeting on Sunday mornings in a local community room of an old folks home, and so it's a public location, and we have visitors coming from the old folks home. We have a few people that are members at the congregation who are bringing their family that isn't Christians, and so right now we've had more opportunities to save souls than we've had in the entire time that we've been there. So we've been there for about 5 months, and like I said, it's getting more consistent all the time. And so keep that work, if you would, in your prayers, and if it be the Lord's will, hopefully we can do some good there. And that brings us right well into this devotion. Turn to Ezra chapter 7 and verse 10. Ezra chapter 7 and verse 10. Now, many of you are familiar with my parents' conversion and my conversion story. And so I can tell you that growing as a Christian, and the most difficult thing that I found when I got to school was trying to have a good kind of skeleton outline of Bible history. There's a lot of characters in the Old Testament, and all the books aren't chronological, so trying to figure out what book was in what time and what the context of that book was probably the biggest thing that I've been working on even to this day. But what you find in the book of Ezra is we're all pretty familiar with the beginning of Bible history that starts in Genesis. And you have God who created all men, and as you read throughout Genesis, it starts to single in to focus on one family, the family of Abraham. And then in Genesis chapter 12, you see the promise that God made to Abraham. It's repeated later on throughout the book, and you follow that lineage all the way to one of Abraham's great-grandsons, and he winds up in the land of Egypt. And that small family turns into a nation right there in Egypt, and they're in slavery because of some past decisions. And God calls on Moses, the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, to take those people out of Egypt, and they go out. God takes them out, and they go out into the wilderness, and they finally get to the promised land eventually, and to Canaan. And then when you get to that point, there are the periods of judges, and then ultimately the people ask God for a king, and he gives in, and he gives them one. And then you have the first 3 kings of Israel, Saul, and then you have David, and then you have Solomon. And then when you get to the point of Solomon's son, you have Solomon's son taking the southern kingdom, the lower 2 tribes of that nation, and one of Solomon's advisors taking the top 10 tribes of Israel. And then when we get to that divided kingdom, eventually that southern kingdom of Israel would fall, and then that lower kingdom would be taken into exile. And then ultimately, when you get to the book of Ezra, and you could pair that right along with the book of Nehemiah, as those were one book when it was first written, that is after the exile. And a word that we may attribute to Ezra and Nehemiah is the idea of restoration. When you read through the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, you find three main characters: Zerubbabel, Ezra, and then Nehemiah, all with different emphasis on the word restoration. Zerubbabel on the restoration of the temple, Ezra on the restoration of the law to the people, and Nehemiah on the restoration of the wall. Well, when you get to the account of Ezra and that verse that we mentioned, Ezra chapter 7 and verse 10, for Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord and to do it, and to teach Israel statutes and judgments. And I said all that just to get to the context of this verse. I didn't want to just read this one verse that this lesson is going to come from and us not have a context of what this verse is talking about. Ezra in Ezra chapter 7 and verse 10 prepared to seek the law of the Lord and to do it, and to teach in Israel statutes and judgments, to restore the law unto the people. Now, the idea of restoration is great to us as members of the Church of Christ in the United States. Now, the church was established in Jerusalem back in AD 33, but when you think about how the church got here, that's a different story. Men restored those ancient truths to at least this part of the country. You know, the church has always been around, but restoration is important, especially to us. And so we get to this time period where Ezra prepared to restore the law, and he prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord, to do it, and to teach others statutes and commandments. Now, there are certain scriptures that when you have the mind of the preacher, or at least you're trying to have a mind like a preacher, you read scriptures and you look at how, what sort of application is there, or what sort of principle is there to me as a New Testament Christian. And right when you look at Ezra chapter 7 and verse 10, really, the scriptures themselves lay out three main points that Ezra did. Ezra, he sought the law, he did the law, and he taught others. But before you get even to that, you notice that Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord. Now, the world understands the necessity of preparation, don't they? Could you imagine a lawyer that was representing a client and he hadn't prepared for the case? Could you imagine a surgeon who was given the task of a surgery and he hadn't prepped himself for the surgery? He hadn't gotten the proper tools and he hadn't gotten the proper drugs to administer to the patient. And the world understands the necessity of preparation. Could you imagine a gospel preacher that didn't prepare or properly prepare for a sermon? In religious duty, certain preparations are essential. There are certain things that an individual must do to become a Christian. We call that preparations to become a Christian. There are certain things that one must do if he wants to be an elder in the Lord's church or a deacon in the Lord's church. Preparation of the heart is extremely necessary. Do you know that the manner in which a man prepares himself is what will decide his outcome? If you read Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 23, keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Keep thy heart, guide thy heart. Because what did the Proverbs writer understand? That what a man was on his inside is what he ultimately will be on his outside. If a man keeps his heart pure, then his actions will be pure. And if a man lets impurities into his heart, well, just the same, his actions can show impurities. And so preparation is important. We might define to prepare as to set, to fix, to purpose, or to determine to do. Now, Ezra, for the most part, was successful in what he set out to do. And this was because he prepared. He prepared his heart. And if we want to get to heaven, it's not going to be by accident. Just as with any task that you seek to do, if you want to do it and you successfully do it, it will not be by accident, but by preparation. Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law. Our choices and actions, as previously stated, must start in the heart. Now, I want to show you two examples from scriptures of men either preparing their heart or not preparing their heart a certain way. You might first notice 2 Chronicles chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. So King Rehoboam strengthened himself in Jerusalem and reigned. For Rehoboam was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city which the Lord had chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, to put his name there. And his mother's name was Naamah, an Ammonitess, and he did evil. And if you go on to read the rest of that verse, it will tell you why he did evil. Because he prepared not his heart to seek the Lord. In the same manner, when we don't prepare our heart to seek the Lord, when we don't make a conscious effort to seek the Lord, well, then we won't seek the Lord. But then you notice the example of Daniel. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now you think about how many of Daniel's brethren went into captivity with him. Now how many do you think remained pure as Daniel did in that time? Well, the only reason that Daniel accomplished that thing which he did was because he prepared his heart to do so. You know, when you prepare your heart to do something, that is like making the decision to do something. I know oftentimes being a part of youth rallies, hearing some sort of youth message, oftentimes in this society we aim some of those messages towards purity in relationships, or purity until you're in your future marriages. And a lot of times we go to this verse in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8 to show that if you want to be pure in the one sense, like Daniel was pure, you have to make that decision in your heart ahead of time. You must purpose in your heart. Again, along those same lines, Job 31:8. I have made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I look upon a maiden? Now, did Job's eyes have a mind of their own? Did Job have to make a deal with his eyes? Or was he saying that he purposed in his heart not to lust in that fashion? And I say all that to say this, that if we want to accomplish a certain goal, we must purpose in our heart to do so. Ezra is likened unto Daniel. Ezra is likened unto Job in the sense that he purposed in his heart. In this case, purposing himself to seek the law of the Lord. Now, Ezra sought the right instruction. We live in a society today with nearly 40,000 denominations. And then when you draw that out, that's nearly 40,000 different religious teachings. You must prepare in your heart to seek the law of the Lord. Ezra didn't seek man's opinion. He didn't seek to please the king, but he sought the law of the Lord. Ezra didn't seek what everyone else was doing. Ezra didn't seek the religious traditions of his family. Galatians 1:14, if you would read that, it's in the context of Paul talking about the past life that he lived in contrast to the life that he lived now for Christ. Galatians 1:14, and profited in the Jews' religion above many my equals in mine own nation, being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of the fathers, of my fathers. And so Paul here speaks of his past, and he talks about the traditions of his fathers. What if a man like Paul were to seek the traditions of men, the religious traditions of his fathers, instead of the truth, instead of the law of God? Because Paul sought the law of God, we note in Scripture all the great things that he did for the cause of the Lord. Should we be Baptist because of our father's past? Or should we be Methodist because of our mother's past? Or should we be Christians because that's what God asks us to be? Notice, secondly, that Ezra had prepared in his heart to do the law. He didn't only seek the knowledge of the law, but he sought to, or at least he prepared his heart to do the law. It is great that Ezra brought the knowledge of the Lord's will, but what if he stopped there? Knowledge alone doesn't do anything without an action call. Imagine that you were in a car going about 60 miles an hour, and you come up over a hill, and a couple hundred feet down the road in front of you, there's a car stopped with its brake lights on, just stopped. And you say, oh, good thing I see that car. Good thing I have this knowledge, because now I can hit my brakes and I won't hit that car. Well, you have the knowledge, but what if the action doesn't follow suit? What if you don't decide to hit your brakes? Well, then you're going to hit that car, even though you may have had better knowledge. One may say that's foolish. That wouldn't actually ever happen. I wouldn't actually ever go up over a hill and see a car stop in the middle of the road and proceed to hit that car. Well, that might be true, but isn't that what we do with sin every day? We have the knowledge of what to do, but when we don't follow through our action with that knowledge, we do something so much more of detriment. Notice Genesis chapter 3 and verses 1 through 6. And we're familiar with the sin of Eve. And if you remember when the serpent came to Eve so as to tempt her, when she responded to him, she knew what the Lord had said. And so she had the knowledge of what to do, but her action didn't follow through with that knowledge. And then you compare that, of course, to Jesus' response to the temptations of the devil in Matthew chapter 4, 1 through 4. Notice the similarities. They both knew truth. They both were tempted. And that's where the similarities stop. One applied the knowledge and one didn't. Notice that a faith without works is dead. James 2, 19 through 20. Thou believest that there is one God, thou doest well. The devils also believe and tremble. But wilt thou know, O vain man, that faith without works is dead? If you study through the book of James, you'll realize that Christian works are the actions that a faithful person does. And so faith is perfected in work, in action. And so a knowledge of the truth without application of the truth doesn't do us any good. A knowledge of the truth without application of the truth is a recipe for soul destruction. Notice thirdly that Ezra had prepared in his heart to teach the law. Not only must we know the truth, not only must we do the truth, but we must teach the truth. Turn to 1 Timothy chapter 2 and read verses 3 and 4 with me. For this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who will have all men to be saved and to come unto a knowledge of the truth. God would have all men come to a knowledge of the truth. God would want all men to be saved. But the problem is that men can't come to a knowledge of the truth unless they're taught by others. And that's why God commissions us Christians to teach. When you look at Romans, how can they hear without a preacher? When you look at the Great Commission given to us 4 different times in different words, all boiling down to teach, make disciples, and then teach them what I taught you. Men can be saved by obedience to the truth. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 22. One more point about teaching before we close is that it's reliant on the other 2 points. You see, if you don't seek knowledge, if you don't prepare your heart to seek that knowledge, well, then you don't have that knowledge to draw from to teach anyone else. If you don't act on that Bible knowledge, if you don't do, well, you also can't teach. For what reason? Because when you go to people and tell them this is what they're supposed to do, they're going to call you a hypocrite. And so you have to search the law of the Lord, do the law of the Lord, and teach others. Now, we understand that the context of Ezra chapter 7 and verse 10 was the Old Testament. And that law, though it was from the same God, he was teaching them a different law than we are under today. But the principles are there. If we want to restore the knowledge of truth to a generation, we have to follow that recipe. We have to seek the law, we have to do the law, and we have to teach others. We must set in our hearts that which we seek to do, because if we don't prepare our hearts to do so, then the outcome likely won't follow. We must remember Ezra's end was not met by accident, but rather they were goals met by goal setting. Ezra prepared his heart to do those three things. And so if you want to get to heaven, as we mentioned at the beginning of this sermon, that doesn't happen by accident. If you want to do the will of the Lord, that doesn't happen by accident. You have to seek that will. This evening, if you want to be a child of God, that will not happen by accident. But you have to turn to His Word and see what you must do to become such a child. You must hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. And if you would like to become a child of God, I hope you would make that choice this evening as we come and as we sing together.